for those of you who aren't part of the department or the project, I'm Nick Cornell. I'm one of the postgraduate students who have taken on the project this year. So the Thinking Africa project has been running since 2010 and has selected a theme each of those years and then had a colloquium. And is very much built into the kind of postgrad curriculum. And that has culminated this year in a team of postgraduate students being part of running the project, which, as I say, I'm one of. And the theme that we decided on this year and going forward after this year, actually, as the kind of general framework, is Pedagogy of Place, which essentially just means the relationship between what we learn and where we are. And we decided on that theme, and then what has happened on campus and at UCT, so I suppose on campuses across the country, has blown up. And we really realized that kind of just reaffirmed for us the importance of this idea and the importance of this discussion, which is also why it's going to remain the framework of our discussion going forward after this as well, because we can't hope to cover that. But we can try, and it's a continuous discussion, and it's a very big discussion that some facets of which have come more to the light here and some at UCT, and hopefully will continue through the April teach-in and then the September colloquium that we're going to have. Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to have 3 speakers. Leonard, who is leading the project with our team and has been part of the project since its inception, and then Molapo is going to speak, and then Louise Vincent, and they are all involved in the study of institutional culture and hopefully institutional cultural transformation and how that happens. So they're each going to speak for 5 or so minutes and introduce how they were led to it and what they're interested in about it, and then hopefully we'll be able to have a bit more of a discussion with questions and answers afterwards.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Thanks, Nico. Well, maybe a personal account of my life in philosophy will explain something of my interest in this field. I've been working in the domain of African philosophy for almost 20 years now, starting at Fort Hare. That's my first job, University of Fort Hare, where I arrived as a very continentally trained philosopher from Stellenbosch and taught there, or trying to teach the stuff to students there, and just becoming increasingly aware over my time there that there was a radical discrepancy between what I had to teach and what students needed in order to make sense of their lives. So I started interrogating the philosophical tradition that I was schooled in, and eventually, I suppose, developed an interest in the politics of philosophy, which is not the same as political philosophy, but I started increasingly getting interested in this question of the politics of a discipline, how it can be completely at odds with the place that you live in. So then I started to work in this domain of African philosophy, but about a year ago, through various conversations with colleagues and students, we just realized that 20 years later, the time of my experience coinciding with the so-called New South Africa, we face a huge crisis in the humanities because of the lack of black scholars in the domain. So which I think the most visible sign of the crisis at the South African University is this lack of black scholars in the humanities. So the obvious question is, how do you change that situation? And I think, obviously by addressing the questions of institutional culture and epistemological transformation of curricula together, and that's what I find very useful about critical pedagogy literature, is that they make it quite clear that those aren't two distinct issues. If you approach teaching and being at a tertiary education from the perspective of a critical pedagogy, and you're interested in the kind of power relations that constitute a discipline or a knowledge domain, those same power relations will play themselves out in the institution and in the institutional culture. So it's the totality of the question that I think has suddenly become very pertinent for us in South Africa. Now, my other thought is, maybe that I just want to start off with, is I think we started to ask this question over the last 20 years about the appropriateness of curriculum in South Africa, framed in a very kind of nationalist matrix. You know, there was all this talk about African Renaissance, and it was talk about Africanizing the curriculum and the institutions. And I think that kind of nationalist matrix or paradigm has played itself out. It was never going to be that easy, and the problem inherent in that discourse of assuming that you can articulate something like a black subjectivity particular to a place was always going to be, or flirt very dangerously with the kind of essentialism. So I think the place we're finding ourselves in at the moment is, the way I read it, a kind of post-nationalist moment, where we have to find alternative ways of posing this question about what it means to teach at a post-colonial African institution. What does it mean to make claims about the relevance of knowledge, beyond and outside the easy talk about Africanizing this or that. And I think, again, the pedagogy of place seems to me a very useful way of reframing what are essentially similar questions, but putting those questions in a different frame that is not prone to the kind of difficulties or pitfalls that a nationalist discourse would be. So for me, the question, to wrap up from a philosophical perspective, is how do we frame this question about the politics of knowledge at a university that is at once post-colonial and, as Bill Readings would have, post-historical, in the same that it's not simply tied to the nationalist project, the nation, reproductive of the nation state, but a university that is at once at the mercy of local and global forces. And I think, you know, these are the profound tensions that we're going to find playing out in the debate. So that's how I arrived at this topic.
Our role is to facilitate and promote transformation. And part of that is considering how curriculum can be transformed. So we thought this year, instead of asking these very broad questions about curriculum, would narrow the question down to how would consideration of place in curriculum design and delivery enable or facilitate the transformation of the institution as a whole, not just the transformation of the curriculum, but the transformation of the institutional culture, and indeed the transformation of the staff profile here, because I think all these are related, you know, they're systemically related. In the plan that our office has produced, we list a long list of questions that our people who design and deliver curriculum should bear in mind in their design and the delivery of curriculum. And these all, to an extent, speak to place, because place can be seen as the geographical place, it can be seen as the socio-ideological place, and indeed the individual as in a place, kind of understanding of place. Some of the questions that we ask are, what assumptions inform the selection of curriculum content? What determines what knowledge and material is included for study and what knowledge material is excluded? This is a question that was asked in last week's discussions. If you remember well, in the meeting where the VC addressed the students, one student actually stood up to ask this question: how do you determine what content should go into curriculum here? And he was very passionate about the curriculum that he's being subjected to. The other questions that we hope will be asked and addressed through these events that are going to be held this year is, what assumptions determine that some knowledge is positioned as core knowledge and some is positioned at the margins of that knowledge? Again, this is a question that was asked in the Rhodes or White campaign. One poster read, I only have white lecturers and I meet black lecturers when they teach black subjects. What do you mean by black subjects? What do you mean by white subjects, etc.? And other questions that we ask in the institutional transformation plan have to do with the structure of the curriculum itself. You know, dividing off knowledge into these neat little disciplines, what effect does that have on our transformation goals? Does it actually impede our transformation goals or not? The fact that a degree is seen to be achievable in 3 years, whereas the majority of the students do not achieve a degree in 3 years. In fact, the vast majority of students take much longer than that to achieve, to qualify for a degree here. And we also ask, in terms of the structure, the articulation between higher education and basic education. The structure of the curriculum, I should point out, the questions about the structure of the curriculum are not new. They're not post-94 questions. They've been asked, I know, since 1936 or something, because of the high attrition rate that universities in this country have always had. What does that mean? Are we looking outside of our national boundaries in our design of curriculum, and is this the effect that it has? I mean, the high attrition rate, is that one of the effects that our gaze to, I want to say towards the West, has on our education system, etc. The focus this year on place, I hope, as Leonard has said, will help us move away from the debate that has been going on since 1994 about this universities in Africa as opposed to African universities, etc. So looking at the questions from a different angle might actually help us move the discussion forward.
I think there's something really important what you said, which is that when we discussed a theme as a team, and Leonard said pedagogy of place, a lot of us didn't know what that meant, and had gotten to postgrad levels in the politics department without knowing what that meant quite easily, and also hadn't formally looked at critical pedagogy, although we'd obviously, when you study African studies and you read Mbembe, you encounter these things without the name, I suppose. But we wanted to know, do you mean institutional transformation or curricular transformation? And Leonard was very clear that those two things, and that, so even for us it was really helpful to clarify that those two things are so incredibly interlinked and are recognized as so interlinked within the institution.
Yeah, and the students recognize it as well, because in the Rhodes or White campaign that came out quite strongly, yes, that students recognize the fact that the way that the curriculum is structured impacts negatively on the transformation of the staff profile, for example.
Right.
Well, I lead a large research group. There's 20 members ranging from honours through to lecturers and staff of the Community Engagement Office. And we're all looking at topics to do with higher education, institutional transformation. It's often said that the university consists of 3 pillars: research, teaching and community engagement. And for a long time I've been arguing that those things can't be thought of separately, and I've also argued that we shouldn't think of higher education transformation of an institutional culture, but rather we should be thinking in terms of multiple cultures existing in the university. So for example, we might think of a culture of teaching and learning, or many cultures of teaching and learning in the university, some of them subordinated, some of them dominant, and so on. So I just think it's more useful to think in those terms, to think about multiple cultures and how some are dominant and some are subordinated. And one of the things that was absent from our project was looking at community engagement and how we might think of that as a facet of higher education transformation in a way that was true to my sensibility, which is that we shouldn't be separating these things out, but rather thinking of them together. And so at the end of last year, I put in an application to the National Research Foundation. It was really based on the work of a man called David Grunewald, who, it's his term really, the critical pedagogy of place. And we were successful in getting some funds to fund a master's student and also to fund a project which is largely running out of the Department of Journalism. So just to summarize my why I became interested in this idea of place. I mean, I think that for us as South Africans, place has a very profound significance. I mean, after all, the whole of apartheid was about putting people in their place, wasn't it? It was about saying that is your place and that is not your place. And so I think what critical pedagogy of place does is it says, well, not only how do we decolonize space, but how do we re-inhabit it in a way that teaches us not just how to live in a place, I live here, but I think for us the profound moral challenge and educational challenge is not just how do I live in this place, which is a question that Sam Weiss asked, but how do I live well in this place? What would it mean to live well in this place? Not just to live here, but to re-inhabit these places that have been so injured and are so fragile. And obviously place is not just a geographical thing, it's a set of social relationships as well. And so I think that what a critical pedagogy of place has the potential to do is to offer our engagement with one another as students and academics the possibility to exercise transformative agency, not just through engaging with the place that we inhabit, but also through engaging ourselves in relation to that place. So we've tried to theorize then this notion of place as a new way of seeing what we might mean by community engagement, because the question that always arises for community engagement is what is the community and what do you mean by engage? And so I think that the instruments from Pedagogy of Place might offer us some way of thinking about that. You know, what is it, rather than thinking about community, let's think about place. And for me it's a very exciting project in the sense that it offers a true mechanism for multidisciplinarity. I'm always thinking that sometimes people use multidisciplinarity just because it's a sort of the right thing to do, or sexy or fashionable or something. It has to make sense for me, but in this way it really makes sense, because which discipline would not have something to offer us in a sense of being able to come to a more profound understanding of the place that we inhabit here in this university, and to place the university, to locate it in its history and in its context. You know, part of what occurs to me in the debate about Rhodes is that people will say things and not really actually have a historical understanding, for instance, of who Rhodes was, what he did. I was sitting in a very high level meeting the other day, and somebody said, oh, well, you know, it was his money, he could do what he wanted with it. And I just thought that there's an absence of historical sensibility which we could all gain something from. So I think it's all, whether it's zoology, whether it's botany, understanding the plants and their role in the evolution of human life in this part of the world and so on. So for me it's, rather than these old, rather mechanistic ways of conceiving of a common course, for instance, for all students that might offer us some sort of common basis on which to understand one another and ourselves, and a starting point for learning. A common course which says, okay, well, let's take our locatedness in this place. We happen to find ourselves here. We come from many different places and we come into this space. And how do we live well here without having as our ethical starting point a deep sense of what here is, and sort of a humility in our approach to being here, which I sometimes think is absent among us in this university. So that's maybe explaining a little bit about where I'm coming from with this project.